Okay, so some time ago there was just before the official announcement was made, there there was talk that Indiana Jones would require 120 gigabytes of storage, for just in order to have it on there. However, the full requirements for the game have come out, and it's definitely interesting. In fact, now keep in mind this is just for this is just for, like, I guess you could say, the base requirements. So let's start off with the minimum requirements. So it's an Intel Core i7 10700K or a Ryzen 5 3600. That sounds pretty good. 16 gigabytes of RAM. That's pretty sizable, but I mean, I feel like a lot of people have 16 gigs in their PCs these days. Here's for the graphics. An RTX 2600 Super 8GB model, or an Radeon RX 6800 8GB, or an Intel Arc A580. That's for the minimum requirements. The recommended ones require an Intel Core i7-12700K or a Ryzen 7 7700, 32 gigabytes of RAM. And these are the graphics that are required for the recommended, by the way. An RTX 3080 Ti, 12 gigabytes, or a Ryzen RX, I'm sorry, I say Ryzen, an RX 7700 XT, 12 gigabytes. Again, that's just recommended settings. And then on the ultra settings, you have an i7 13900K or a Ryzen 7 7900X, or you still need 32 gigs of RAM. And then you need a RTX 4080 16GB model or an RX 7900 XT 20GB model. And then, like I said, these are just the standard stuff. Then you have the full ray tracing requirements, which essentially all of the stuff is the same except for the fact that with the graphics cards, they're all just Ryzen 4000 series cards. So for the minimum is a Ryzen, why do I keep saying that word? RTX 4070 12GB model for the minimum, an RTX 4080 16GB model for the recommended, and for Ultra, an RTX 4090 24GB model. And also, I'll just mention one thing. It says that this is that an SSD is required, and from what it says, it target for each one. It says that it does target 60 FPS across the board for all the recommended specs. But here's the thing: ray tracing is required. It is a graphic preset, and you cannot disable it. It's on all across the board, even on the standard minimum. Now, I have a lot to say about this, but before I put my thoughts out there, I want to hear what you have to say.
What the crap is this? That's the first thing I have to say. So, the one thing I will, the one and only thing I will give them credit for is that at least with the with the basic minimum recommended in Ultra, which is without full ray tracing, that is native resolution on those 1080p, 1440p, and then 4K. So that's native resolution for those requirements. So I will give them credit on that front, that they're not requiring upscaling to get those things. But that's where it ends. Okay, first of all, ray tracing should never, ever be required. And they say that it will not work without. I guarantee you, probably within the first day, that there's going to be a mod to remove ray tracing, and it's going to make performance shoot way up. People are going to be getting 120 frames per second, 240, whatever. Well, maybe not 240. At least not until they're doing a 4090 at 1080p or whatever. But this is absolute garbage that they are requiring ray tracing. It is a performance killer across the board. And they are requiring something that should never be anything but optional. It's fine if people want the ray tracing, but it should not be required. Not in any way, shape, or form. Then on top of that, if you look at the full ray tracing requirements, and this is path tracing, which is like the super advanced version of ray tracing, that's with upscaling. You have to have upscaling in addition to having these high-end graphics cards. And you have to use performance mode in order to get... actually, let's look at this. So, let me look at that again. So, the full ray tracing minimum requires DLSS 3 with frame generation and the preset quality. And that is for 1080p with 60 with full ray tracing. Then it's basically the same thing for the recommended, which is the balanced preset. Once again, still using DLSS 3 with frame generation. And the one thing I guess the one thing I can say that's at least better about this is DLSS is better than FSR, but that's still not good enough because there's no reason. I mean, frame generation, obviously the only reason why they're requiring frame generation is because they want to use path tracing, and path tracing is, I mean, if ray tracing is a system killer, path tracing is like murdering a system, using paddles to bring it back to life, and then killing it again, then bringing it back to life again, and killing it one more time. It is incredibly demanding, and that's obviously that's the only reason why they're doing the requirement of using DLSS and frame generation. But seriously, there shouldn't be ray tracing as a requirement. It's fine if you want to make it an option, let people have the best looking version of the game, but this is not only bad because of the fact that they're requiring something that some people just straight up don't want, like us, but furthermore because it is so poorly optimized that they are requiring these ridiculous specs. Now, if I was going to get it, which I've already decided I'm not going to, at least not until they get rid of the ray tracing, I could actually hit that 1080p 60 native with the ray tracing without too much difficulty. I have a card that's, my GPUs is above that, my CPU is a little bit above that. Actually, no, I think it's about the same. It's about the same, give or take. My memory is literally 4 times that. So I have a ridiculous amount for that. The storage, 120 gigs is a lot, but there's games that are bigger than that. God of War Ragnarok is like 180 gigs. So, it's not as bad as that, but regardless, there is no excuse for this. There's no excuse for this. I will not be buying it mostly because they're forcing ray tracing on people. And because of what that does to performance, and the specification requirements are evidence of what it does to performance. Now, I know that fanboys are going to say, oh, well, my Xbox and my PS5 and the PS5 can do the ray tracing. It's like, okay, well, the ray tracing you're getting on those systems is not the same. You're upscaling in order to get that resolution. So it's not even close to the same thing at all. It's probably going to be rendering, I'm going to say, at best, at like 800p to get up to 4K. It's going to be rendering at 800p and upscaling to 4K. And it'll still look good, but anyway, It's just garbage. This is such garbage, and I'm just gonna keep repeating myself. So go ahead, your thoughts.
Okay, so you actually are more forgiving than me on several aspects, just because, I mean, for the first thing I heard when I saw there was 120 gigabyte, requirements, I was just like, are you insane? Like, what's with these games? Like, Call of Duty was supposed to be 100 plus gigs, and I mean, I wasn't aware that God of War Ragnarok was 180. I mean, I feel like I still haven't touched these types of games that have those requirements, because the largest game that I can think of that I've ever installed was probably maybe around 80, and even then I'm just like livid at this, at how much space is being required. So I mean, I guess it's not as bad, but I still just I wish games were, I wish the games were smaller enough. I mean, consider the fact that back in the 90s they made games that were like Doom, and they put in like, I don't know, like 16 kilobytes, and then you've got these games that are just like, yeah, we're just like take all the space we can use. So I'm like, whatever happened to optimization? I mean, you've got Nintendo of all people, even though if the games aren't that graphically impressive, they're able to take like I think they were able to get Breath of the Wild onto, what was it, like, it was no more than 16 gigabytes of storage for a cartridge. So they're able to do all that and optimize their games to fit, but you guys can't, optimize the storage for your games. Like, what's going on here? But yeah, and it's really disappointing, because as you said, I think for the most part, outside of the GPU requirements, everything is pretty reasonable, I would say. I mean, the Intel requirements, the AMD requirements, like those I think are pretty reasonable, and in fact I'm kind of, in a sense, kind of surprised that those kinds of CPUs are still able to do this type of stuff. But as you said, ray tracing should not be a requirement. It should be an option, because that's really the thing that's killing everything here. And the fact is that like, without ray tracing you cannot play these games. So if you have an older NVIDIA card, if you have anything before the RTX line, so if you got like a GTX 1060, not 1060, a 1660, or something like that, or if you have a 1080 Ti, even those are cards that could still play stuff today, you can't play anything on them because of the fact that they don't have tensor cores or support ray tracing, which is ridiculous, because there still is some life in them even all these years later. And you might say, oh, well, that's just the way of the times, you gotta get some new stuff, you can't play on the old hardware forever. That's true, but at the same time, locking everything away because of one aspect of a setting is ridiculous. Like, imagine if older games, back when games had this, like, imagine if you couldn't play any type of the older games that had what was it, NVIDIA physics or something like that. Imagine if you couldn't play any games because you didn't have a card that supported physics, even though that was an optional thing that would only be disabled, was automatically disabled if you didn't have a card that supported it. But if you did, then you would have that option. That's what ray tracing should be, is an option that's disabled, but if you have the card that can do those types of things, then it's enabled and you can select it. So like, this is completely ridiculous. And I mean, also, as you said, like, AMD is not great with ray tracing. Like, that's something that they're massively behind in that aspect. I mean, as far as restoration goes, AMD is doing a pretty good job. Not the greatest. I mean, they're still falling behind NVIDIA in that aspect, but for the most part, rasterization is something that where AMD really shines. So the fact that if you have an AMD card that is older than, I think it was like the 6000 series cards, then you really can't play it, which is kind of funny, because or at least the computer I'm using for gaming right now, it meets all of the requirements except for the GPU, because it's an RX 5800 model, which, not 5800, 580. So, which is an older card, and it does not support ray tracing at all. So, I couldn't play this game at all. And I mean, I have a 3080 Ti, but like I'm not gonna pop that into this PC just for that, and also like my power supply would be able to handle it, but what at right now, so that has to go into the separate PC that I'm gonna be building. But the fact is, like, no one should have to buy a newer graphics card just for that. I mean, considering the fact, I mean, some people like to buy something that lasts a long time because they're like, they have the hardware. They said, I'm satisfied with what I have. It gets me the performance I want. It's something that I know lasts for a while, and something, you know, say someone bought or made a PC some X number of years ago, and what they bought was, you know, pretty standard stuff for the time, and maybe even high end at the time. Like, again, if you bought, say, a 1080, well, I mean, that's still like some rods away, but say you bought a card right before the generation before they had, you know, tensor cores and ray tracing and stuff like that, and all that type of stuff. If you were just a generation behind and you had a PC that does everything you need or wanted it to do, and all of a sudden the games say you're required to have these special types of chips in your GPU, otherwise you can't play the game, like, it's ridiculous. And in a sense, it almost kind of creates e-waste, because it's like, well, now I gotta like get rid of this stuff so I can get something else. Like, I find it completely ridiculous that stuff like that can happen. So I like you, I definitely will not be buying this game. And even it, you know, later down the line, when I build my new PC and, you know, have that type of capability, it's not still a game that I wouldn't buy, just because I do not want to support having this type of mentality where we're going to force you into ray tracing whether you like it or not. Because you said it's a performance killer. And in the article that you sent me earlier, there's a part where it's mentioned about NVIDIA explaining full ray tracing is a demanding but highly accurate way to render light and its effects when it's seen, used by visual effects artists to create film and TV graphics that are indistinguishable from reality. Well, who said I wanted to have reality in my video game? You know, sure, I would, having a game with some pretty nice textures and graphics would be great, but if it's at the cost of me having a subpar experience as far as the gameplay goes, I don't want it. Get rid of that. It's garbage to me. I don't want anything to have to do with that. So I really hate the fact that we have these, we have this, I guess, standard of having lifelike realism pushed into our games when we don't want it because of the impact that it has on our performance. So I definitely am against this completely, and I really hope that there is a huge fuss made about this upon the release on the PC end of things.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to repeat myself much more. But, and until they make ray tracing no longer required, I will not buy this game. Because even though I have a PC that could do what I would want to do, 1080p, 60 minimum, potentially higher because I do have higher specs in a variety of areas, I'm just not okay with them forcing us to do ray tracing. I do not want ray tracing in my game, not when it is such a performance killer. Now, when I was talking about FSR versus DLSS, I wasn't specifically referring to ray tracing. I was just talking about the upscaling in general, because FSR is garbage upscaling, and DLSS is actually pretty good. I tried it out a couple times in games just to, you know, improve performance, even without the frame gen. And I don't like that at all. I'd much rather just have native, you know, and if necessary, turn down some settings. I mean, I think DLSS is a lot better than FSR, like, significantly better. But I still I prefer not using it if I don't have to. Now, I will say, if DLSS was an option on the Steam Deck, I would probably use it for games that struggle on performance, because DLSS does work well enough to where I don't think it would be detrimental to the experience, whereas with FSR, it really is, and it basically doesn't really do anything to performance. It doesn't improve performance, it just makes the games look worse. And it's like, okay, so I'm rendering at lower resolution, I'm gaining maybe 2 frames occasionally, not even all the time, this isn't worth it at all. So, anyway. That's all I got. Anything else from you?
No, sir.